Welcome on behalf of Tether Tools to this panel discussion on the topic of limitless creativity. My name is Matt Hensler. I am VP of Marketing with Tether Tools. I'm joined today by three tremendously talented photographers and educators. Joining us from Switzerland is food photographer Lauren Short. Logging in from the UK is composite and portrait photographer Glyn Dewis. And then from California, we've got adventure and outdoor photographer Chris Orwig. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Over to a computer or other device where you can see it more clearly and work with it in real time. That creates a lot of advantages in directing composition, collaborating with clients, reducing post-production work, and in general, knowing exactly when you've got the shot that you had intended. For those that do tether, there's recognition that it really is an essential link between a photographer and their process. Recognizing photography is, of course, a creative pursuit. That's what we're here to talk about with photographers today. Mastering that technical workflow really serves a purpose to open up that creativity even more. In its basic form, tethering involves a camera that can tether, and then we need a cable, which is the device that's going to get that cable or that image off of that camera, and then a device with a software application that you can ingest those images into in order to see them. Now, the tethered workflow has really evolved over time to include additional functions. And so beyond the cable, there's other opportunities to transfer images using wireless devices. Photographers are looking to protect their equipment on set, making sure that you can create workstations where you can collaborate with subjects, with your clients, being able to power your gear, and then, of course, directing that shoot using software to make sure that you can really bring that creative vision to focus. So for its part, Tether Tools really focuses on supplying versatile gear designed especially for you to improve your process, ideally without changing how you work. With a more dependable workflow, we want to make sure that you're worrying less about that tech that's being utilized within the workflow, and then really free you up to focus on that creative process. So now moving on into our panelists, what I want to do is kind of take a look at how those advances in tethering have really made the practice more accessible to different types of photographic styles, with flexibility, not just for the type of photography, but also the individual photographer. So for example, this is how a tethered workflow might look for studio portraiture. So of course, we've got our SONY camera. And then, USB cable. Tether Tools is really well known for its orange cables, being able to manage that cable with some sort of cable management device, making sure that you have that workstation potentially with another monitor or a tablet where you can share those images, there on set or even remotely with others, and then tethering into a product like Lightroom. So that's sort of like one option on how that might be composed. But let's talk a little bit with Glyn Dewis and learn about his background, his work as a photographer, and then sort of how he kind of manages his creative process within the context of that technical workflow. Glyn, how's it going?
Hello. Yeah, really good. Really, really good. Well, do you know what this whole kind of background to me being as a photographer, I started out as a retoucher. So I was kind of like 12, 13 years ago. I think it was that long. It seems the older I get, time seems to be going quicker, but I think it was about 12 years ago that I started out as a retoucher. So I was mainly working in Photoshop, and eventually I then moved over to the photography side of it because I was kind of getting sick and tired of people thinking there was a make it look good filter. Which as we know there isn't. And then I kind of picked up the camera and kind of ran with it. And sort of fast forward, I guess now 12 years. And now my thing is portraiture. I still kind of heavily involved in the Photoshop side of things and the education of that. But my main thing is, I would call it controlled environment portraits.
Okay. Well, one of the things that was fascinating about the examples that I put up here is the fact that you were actually taking a photo of an object in front of a screen and then presuming using that tethered workflow to really see how that composition is going to come together.
Yeah.
What can you share about that setup?
Well, it's a real simple one. In fact, if I talked very briefly about my own tethering setup, it's been something that I kind of adopted very, very early on in my kind of photography life, using the tethered kind of side of things with the orange cable. And that is pretty much how it's remained up until recently, because I am making changes to it now, because obviously there's way more things that we can do with it. But that particular shot there that you can see, that's something that came about during lockdown, because being a portrait photographer, what I was doing prior to the lockdown and the restrictions that we're living in, I was basically touring around the UK photographing surviving World War II veterans, and it was covering, thousands of miles that I was doing. But then I was no longer able to do that. So whilst we're in this lockdown, there's only so many times I can photograph my wife or this polystyrene mannequin head that I've got on my bookshelf. So I thought, well, I'll just do something that is going to enable me to keep the tools in my hand, keep me creative, and just keep me on that learning curve. So I decided to do something that I've never done before, which was making airfix models. And I wanted to recreate my own kind of versions of digital paintings of wartime aviation aircraft flying through the sky. So it was all done in my office on the table there. You can see one of the models on a little small tabletop tripod. It's about 5 inches wide, I think, that little model there. And being able to shoot tethered with that was vitally important, because I was having to do focus stacking with it. So seeing the images coming in on the laptop, as you can see there, made the process a heck of a lot easier. And also photographing it for the first time, I'd never done this, photographing it against a non-reflective screen kind of speeded the process, putting the whole picture together as well. So I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I would never have done that had we not been through lockdown. So this has kind of been a huge positive for me, and something I'll be carrying on as well.
So you found that maybe slowing down gave you an opportunity to sort of like let that creativity just sort of unravel, and came up with some cool ideas on how to and ways to spend your time, which is remarkable.
Yeah, I think if I hadn't done this, I think I'd have gone a little bit sort of stir crazy. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm one of these people that if I go a couple of days without having taken a portrait, I kind of go a little bit on edge. I feel like I need to be out there doing something. So this has kind of kept that at bay. And I think this is probably going to develop into something more than I anticipated, because for the first time ever, these are going to be pictures I'd actually want to have on my wall, as opposed to pictures of people I photograph, which I kind of wouldn't put on my wall, if that makes sense. These I want to have framed on my wall. And so does my wife, which is a real bonus.
There you go. Well, so moving on to another example of food photography, again, a little bit of an alternate way to do a tethered workflow. Again, of course, that SONY camera popping up, again, utilizing that USB cable. But a couple of different ways that you may work in food photography, where, now you're taking a set of wheels and roller system and putting it on the bottom of your tripod, making sure that you've got a battery pack that can is powerful enough to power your laptop, making sure that you have some other equipment and gear that can help kind of tie it all together, so you have a nice little mobile workstation, whether you're in a pub, whether you're at a restaurant, or even in a smaller studio type setting. And then, of course, another type of tethered capture software that enables you to capture images slightly different, to ingest those, but being able to focus in multiple areas of an image, and really just kind of, again, gearing that workflow toward the unique needs of that particular photographic style. And so, Lauren, to kind of kick off your intro, the question that I wanted to ask you was, you're doing food photography, and you're really, taking somebody else's creativity and putting it on display, whether it's, a dish or, a certain type of cocktail. So how do you add your mark onto someone else's creativity when you're doing that photographic work?
That's a really interesting question. I was thinking about this a bit in preparing for this, as in, I think a lot of people don't always realize in this industry that a food photographer and a food stylist are very different jobs, and I am not a food stylist. I like to sort of think of it as, if I was a portrait photographer, I'm not the makeup artist. Like, I can photograph the subject, but I'm not going to be the one doing doing the face paint or whatever. So with food, I guess it's sort of like that. I would say in terms of establishing my own style in photography, it comes down a lot to the kind of composition techniques that I find myself reaching toward again and again. I like to sort of do a little sketch of my photos before I start if I'm working on a client shoot, to make sure that I'm not walking into a shoot with that sort of blank canvas feeling, because you can't direct food. You can't be like, oh, could you just scoot a bit or just smile a bit? You know, it's just a sandwich or whatever it could be. You have to kind of do everything to it. And when you walk into a shoot and you've just got your background and your camera and it's like an empty screen, it can be a bit overwhelming. So I tend to start with a composition technique, whether that's like the rule of thirds or the golden triangle or the golden ratio, the phi grid. And I'll kind of build from there through props and angles. And I think as a food photographer, you find yourself experimenting with things like lighting directions and the tones of the background you use and the tones of the props, and everything is very controlled, but you do sort of find yourself applying similar things to different shoots over and over again, which I think can help give you a bit of a unique style.
Chris, before we get into your introduction of kind of this final way that I wanted to use as an example of how this tethered workflow can be so versatile, I will again call out the fact that we're going to have a SONY camera as part of that equation. And I'm sure people are wondering, I bet you say that to all the camera manufacturers, but certainly glad to be here hosted by SONY. In this setup, when you're outdoors or on location, right, maybe not wanting to pull that cable out of your bag, there are wireless transfer devices and alternatives that can be considered. Being able to take a really lightweight table out on location with you is important, with some other gear that can help protect your equipment or kind of help you optimize your workspace when you're out there. A really popular one, particularly for SONY shooters, is auxiliary power. Like you can see the case relay system here on the slide. And then again, another type of capture software. So wanted to share all of those examples just again to kind of create and show that versatility and the way that tethering can play such an important role in that overall creative process, but can be adapted very differently depending on the type of shooter that you are. So Chris, let's talk about your style. And that setup that I just showed actually is very close to one that you use for a shoot you did for us recently. And so let's talk a little bit about one of the questions I have for you, Chris, is, how has your creative style changed over the course of your career? And then how has it changed?
Yeah, great question, and huge honor to be on this panel with Glyn and Lauren. And I think, the first thought I have is it's the coolest thing about Tether Tools, for me at least, is that it is this company that is really grounded and is about helping people create. It's empowering, and it's like a family, right? And it's empowering in a way that we can all be ourselves. So Glyn has his own style, Lauren has hers, and I have mine, and that's the beauty of it. So it's even adaptable within. I think what your question is great. It's adaptable in the sense of the arc of a photographer, which is we all start somewhere, and it's in 10 years from now, I will be taking different images than I take today, and that's the nature of progress and of growth and of evolution and of aging and all these things. So anyway, all that being said, is my beginning was very free form. It was very just trying to find photographs, not make or create photographs. So it was like, there's something interesting, a hubcap, take a picture. There's a California poppy, take a picture. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was almost just following an instinctual response to the world. And then I think a lot of us evolved. I think this could be true. I don't know if it's true for you, Lauren and Glyn, and maybe I'll ask that question in a second. But most people start off as generalists, and then they refine. Is that true for you guys? Is that how it happened?
Totally. I kind of went out there and photographed everything. I was told, when you don't know what you want to do, photograph everything, and that will make you realize what you do want to do. And I very quickly realized that a controlled environment portraits is what I do.
Yes. Okay. Lauren, how about you?
Yeah, for me, it was actually kind of the opposite. I had no idea that I was going to become a photographer. I started a food blog as a hobby alongside my job in tax. Um, and then
In
through that,
tax, like
yeah,
taxes?
I used to work
Okay.
in expat tax. So,
Okay. Keep going.
very
Yeah.
similar. And I realized sort of as I was doing that, that I enjoyed the photography side more than I enjoyed the cooking as much as I love cooking. So it kind of evolved from that very specifically into food photography straight away. And now I'm working on improving my landscape photography and getting really interested in other types of photography. So yeah, different way in, but for
Yeah.
sure interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe the thread. I mean, I could be overstretching this, but you were a generalist in the sense that you were doing something other than photography, and then you found a way in, and then you pursued that. So anyway, so for me, I mean, Matt, sorry, I'm going on this big tangent,
Oh,
but
you're great.
I have sitting right here, my little Air Direct. I don't know if you guys can see that, but and I have my cable. So I would say I'm a bit more of I enjoy outdoors and I like the natural world anytime. So cables out there are always complicated as far as tripping over them, talent or myself or snagging on things. I mean, in a studio, it works really well. You know, it's bright orange, everyone sees it, you tape it down or but when you're out there and all of a sudden light and wind and elements, being able to do the wireless thing for me is boom. It's like, oh my gosh, that's really changed everything. And what it's helped me to do is to add a layer of intentionality. And what I love about food photography, I also love the same thing about painting and Glenn about your style, is this intentionality to it. There's a thoughtfulness. There isn't like throw food on a table and shoot it. Like that never works. Or even,
Right.
Glenn, your most recent project, which seriously just love, love, love. You have this sense that there's this thoughtfulness. And so I think for me, why I'm saying all this and why I think it matters, and I'm an educator at heart, is for people who want to separate themselves from the crowd, who want to get better pictures, you have to learn how to become more thoughtful and more intentional and more reflective. And you need that quicker feedback. I think those of us who shot film, we would shoot a week later, you get the film, you'd look at your notes, you would compare, and there was a feedback loop that was a week long. Now, let's say we shoot mirrorless and you have like a 1 second, feedback loop, but it's still small and a little distant. When I do that and it shows up on, I don't know where my laptop is, my laptop, all of a sudden that feedback loop, it's quick, but it's also more informative. And that information is either, at least for me, I don't know about for you guys, sometimes it's shocking, like, oh my gosh, that's so bad. That happens a lot. I think, wow, like really, I made that mistake. I'm still making that mistake. Other times it's surprising in a good way, like, whoa, I really like what I'm seeing. I'm sure this happens in food photography. You kind of get it aligned and you're like, wait, that's good. But rather than having to wait a week or waiting to get back to the computer, that loop is much quicker. And so I think the growth is faster. So again, Matt, I don't even know if I answered your question, but I just got all excited.
No, I think you did. And I think we want to explore this further as we go further into our channel, or I'm sorry, our panel topics. I will say that as I was putting this together, I did not want to be outdone, and so I am not a photographer, but I do take some okay, mediocre iPhone photography, and wanted to kind of bring some of that forward. And I think that's kind of the wonderful thing about creativity. It's really about how and photography, right? It's the idea of capturing a moment that inspired you or that can inspire others. And so you got a couple of great shots of my kids from some of our outdoor excursions recently. I think the one on the far right is they found a bug, and that was like at least 10 minutes of them occupying their time. So I just wanted to kind of have some fun with that. But one of the things I do want to share about myself is that most of my background is from agency. And so I spent a lot of time as a client services professional, do brand strategy and marketing planning for companies. And in my career, I came across this really great presentation once from some creative directors at an agency called Stein IAS. And they had written this book called 101 Cliches. And so as we move into one of the things I want to talk about was, how do you balance trends? You know, if you're trying to really embrace creativity, but trends are a thing, I mean, how do you kind of strike that balance in knowing what to adopt and how to still put your own style on it? And then, because I'm an ad guy, I will embrace the idea of cliches through some of these slides, and you'll see that as we walk through them.
Okay.
Chris, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think, I mean, what I'm hearing a little bit in the question is well, I'll interpret it in my own language, maybe, which is, for me, when there are cliches or things that have been done, let's say a certain photograph, like you're standing at an iconic location, or maybe if it's food photography, it's a cupcake, and you're like, everyone's photographed a cupcake, or it's a portrait, and like everyone uses Rembrandt lighting or whatever. What I always think, I think back to one of my friend and mentors who's a National Geographic guy. He used to tell me, Chris, if you're going to photograph the Golden Gate Bridge or San Francisco, day one, do the postcard shot, do the cliche. Day two, do the work of a photographer. If you only have 10 minutes, first 5, get the obvious shot. Second 5, do the work of a photographer. And so rather than beat yourself up, kind of lean into it and push through it. And I found with my students, a lot of times they'll freeze, they'll get stuck creatively, because they're like, yeah, a girl holding a red balloon, like, you know, let's say, because I taught at a photography school for a while, a lot of people have done that. And I say, yeah, great, do it. You haven't done it. And then once you've done that, then iterate and move past that, you know, and see where it goes. So rather than seeing cliches as a stopping point, they can be just sort of something along the path, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love the line, doing the work of the photographer. So I'm going to go to Glyn, and I want to have him interpret that line and statement, and maybe see how he kind of makes the distinction between person with camera pushing the button and then the work of a photographer.
Yes, I want to hear this as well. I can't wait.
Well, I'm glad this has been brought up, actually, because I think we kind of touched on this yesterday when a few of us were chatting. Certainly over the last couple of years, my approach to photography has changed a heck of a lot. And I think that's because of who I have been photographing. Whereas before, I would be concentrating so much on the technical side of it, which is how I interpreted what a photographer should be, you know, thinking of all the technicals and the light setups and everything that comes with that. What I have certainly learned, I would say, over the last 2 years, is the fact that really, for me, the work of a photographer isn't the technicals, it's all about communication. Because, you know, if I will sit down and talk to somebody before any kind of kit has been mentioned or brought out or set up, I would probably spend, you know, 75% of my time talking to them before I'll even get the camera out. And by doing that, there's a whole load of benefits for me that I've found, is that I am told, because I wouldn't say that I do it myself, but I am told that I actually capture the person. Because the amount of times, certainly in the last 2 years, where people have said, oh, that is so them, as opposed to, oh, that's nice. It's completely changed just by talking to them, to get them relaxed for one thing, but also realizing when I do talk to them, what kind of a portrait should I do? And what I mean by that is that I kind of quickly realized that some people I want to photograph with them looking eyes at the camera. But some other people, because the way they come across when I'm talking to them and their attitude and their posture and everything about them, it needs a different kind of portrait. And they'll be the ones maybe where I'm getting them to look past the camera, because they have something about them. When people look at their portrait, they just immediately go, my God, what are they thinking about? What have they seen? What have they done? It doesn't work with everybody. Yeah. Some people look great looking at the camera. Some people look great looking past the camera. But as a photographer, I wouldn't know that unless I'd taken the time to sit and talk with them. That is the majority of my work, is sitting and talking to people before I take the picture.
Yeah, those are great points. Lauren, I wanted to ask you sort of about this balance of technology and creativity, right? There's this concept of the innovator's dilemma, which is how, you know, technology is so pervasive within our lives. I know, as a dad of a couple of elementary school kids, tomorrow they start their second attempt at distance learning since the spring. Okay. And there is an obscene amount of devices at my house now to make sure that everyone's prepared for that. And so when you look at creativity and technology and photography, is it possible to uncouple those? Or I'm sorry, uncouple those. And if you had to, what would be a situation where you sort of abandon that technology just for the sake of focusing on the photographer's work? I love that statement, so I'm going to keep bringing that back.
So I think in my journey, because it all started from this place where I wasn't looking to become a photographer. I started from that place of just really looking at things of, how do I want to tell this story? How is this subject going to be interesting? Like, I think one of the really interesting and beautiful things about food is that every single time you make something, it's different. Even though every person is different, every cupcake is different, every dish is different. There's so many cultures and stories and emotions involved with food as well. And I think it's really important just to remember that. So one of the things that I really like to do, kind of like Glyn said, before bringing in all the kit and the lights and the tethering station and everything, I will sometimes just take a dish, and it's often something that I'm not quite sure yet how I want to shoot it. And I'll just go handheld with, the simple light from my window, just explore it, different angles, different lighting directions. I'll try a bit of backlight, a bit of side light, different angles, different action shots, and just kind of get a feel for it and see what's working with this, what's not working. And then I know when I want to bring in that gear and I want to set up that controlled environment, I can use the technology to aid that creative vision rather than basing the vision for the shot on the technology. It's like using the technology to enable the creativity. And that's why I think both things go together so well, because you need both. I mean, yeah, you can do incredible things without any gear, like that's 100% for sure. But for sure, also the gear and the technical stuff, it adds a lot if you know how to use it to create the vision in your mind. And I think with food, it is a very controlled environment as well, but taking that time to just be a bit free sometimes and not lock yourself down straight away with a strobe and a tripod, it's important as well.
Yeah. Chris, what would you say are some of your creative go-tos when you're out shooting? I mean, do you sort of repeat things, or do you try not to do that? And do you have any of those sort of staples that people would look over time and say that is signature Chris Orwig?
Yeah, definitely. I think this will be a little shameless plug. I have a new book out, Authentic Portraits, and someone had written a comment. When you write books, they always tell you don't read the Amazon reviews, but it's really hard not to. And one of the reviews was, you didn't put enough about the technical settings of all the images. I did in the back of the book. I intentionally pulled that back, and this is going to answer your question, so this is relevant. But one of the reasons why I didn't is my technical settings are almost always the same. Shoot wide open. And then I have a few different types of light that I like to work with: open shade, backlight, open shade, kind of side, whatever. So I do have certain things which I turn to, and I think within that, that is, and let's say if I'm using light sources or external lights, there are certain light sources that I tend to like. I think, and part of that I think is actually a good thing for me, because I'm one of those people who, the way I approach creativity is through limits. And I guess what I mean by that is, if you were to say, let's just go to lighting modifiers. If I were to go to ProPhoto and they set out 100 different lighting modifiers and said, Chris, pick 30, I would just be like, I don't even know where to begin. But if they said you have 3 lighting or you have 1 light, now begin, I would say game on. Mm-hmm. And I've seen that with my students as well, that sometimes we have this idea that creativity means anything goes. But I like Igor Stravinsky, the composer, used to say he couldn't compose a song until he decided the key. So he would say, this is G major or B flat minor or whatever it is. So he had the key, which is the parameters, the limits, and then the creativity happened. And so anyway, for me, I do impose limits. And one more little answer to this is when I'm shooting, say, for a client like Patagonia, which is an outdoor apparel company, they have a list of 10 things that cannot be in the photographs. No plastic, no fences, no telephone poles, and so on. And all of their no's, they direct you to a yes. So I tend to find that very helpful. And for me, that's where the technology too can help. Like we were talking about when to use it and how to use it. And it is to try to find technology that's very simple and that's very direct and clear. And Tether Tools obviously fits into that mix, so that I'm not thinking, what if I just added this, or if I did 16 other things here, it dilutes. So anyway, for me, I'm one of those guys that needs the limit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Well, I think there's this idea of like freedom and focus, right?
Yeah.
Where
Such
as
a
an
bad way to
advertising
say it.
agency person is that like the purpose of a creative brief in the ad agency world, which you could go to a designer or creative director and give them a blank piece of paper and say, do something creative around this product. They're gonna have a hard time, right? You give them a brief, like an idea, a single idea that they can sort of use as their guardrails, you get brilliant work, right? And then they can do their craft, apply their skill set, and that's where the brilliance comes from. So I think it's a fair point that you made. Glyn, I'd love to hear from you about a creative idea that you tried to pull off and just had a hard time doing it, right? Like you could see it very clearly in your mind, and then translating that, to actually, capture it was just painstaking and difficult. Can you talk to us and give us an example of that?
Oh man, that's on the spot, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow. I'm trying to think of one now. I think I can't sort of maybe say one particular time that maybe happened. However, I can give you a kind of like I say well, I can't give you one particular instant when that happened, but I can certainly give you a time frame when that would happen more than often. And that would be before now, when I kind of seemed to have this mindset when I was early on in my photography career, that I seemed to think that every time I did a photo shoot, there was something technically different I had to do the next time. So let's say if, last Saturday I did a photo shoot and I used one light. For some reason, my mindset was that the next time I get my camera out and do a photo shoot, I can't be seen to do the same thing, because that means I'm just not improving. So I'll have to do something different. So I would maybe think I'd have to use two lights. And so often I would overcomplicate things and I wouldn't get the result that I ultimately wanted. So what I ended up doing was literally stripping it back to basics yet again, to the point that I'm going to say, right, from now on, I'm going to use natural light. And I kind of push the natural light, which is actually something I want to go back to now. And Chris, you've motivated me to do that because of your book, which I did read the Amazon reviews, by the way, and they made no difference. I still ordered it. But I when it came to the lighting side of things, I thought, right, let's just stick at one light. That's all I'm going to do, stick at one light. So that when I do eventually find myself wanting to have extra stuff in there, I know why I'm doing it, as opposed to just having it for the sake of having it. So as it happens at the moment, I'm quite happy sticking with one light. So to answer your question, Matt, really, it was when I was overcomplicating things that I didn't get the results I wanted. When I simplified it, that's when it started to work.
Yeah.
And actually, that's when my style started to appear. Because I would every time I did it, I would have 15 images in a portfolio that could have been from 15 different photographers. Mm-hmm. Whereas now I would like to think that if you look at my portfolio, you kind of know that they were from my series, if you like.
Yeah. Well, Lauren, same question over to you. And you mentioned working with food stylists, and you're, you probably have a lot of scenarios in food where you sort of have a limited time with a shot that you've set up. Maybe it's, putting some sort of like mist on a glass to make it look, like the condensation's just right. So, talk about that same question, where, you've been challenged to how do you accommodate those short time windows with some of the shots that you're trying to get?
So in terms of time windows, one of the things that was a breakthrough for me, that it feels really obvious now, like why did I not always do that? But it's just pre-lighting. I will set up my scene with all my props, I'll put in little standby things if it's helpful to see that. If it's just a flat lay, normally I'll just put in the props. I get all the lighting set, I get everything the way I want it, pretty much like 90% of the way there. Then the food can be brought in and pretty much snapped. So it's not sitting there sort of like gradually wilting and looking awful. By the time we're like, oh, now the strobe's where I want it, but now the lettuce looks like rubbish. So, you know, it was kind of like that. But in terms of a technical challenge or something that was difficult to get over, for me, it was learning how to do splash shots. So I really wanted to create these, particularly like more creative drinks photography, where you see like an ice cube or something being dropped in and this splash, but it's like frozen, like completely frozen. And it just took me a long time to realize that you just can't do that with natural light. There's too much motion blur. You need a shutter speed of around 1/8,000th of a second to capture water frozen. And there's no, unless you're like next to the sun, there's no way you can have 1/8,000th of a second and still get a good exposure. So it was about learning how to use artificial light in a specific way to make those shots possible. So I was learning about things like the T.1 ratings and what kind of flash power enables you to get an equivalent shutter speed. And that allowed me to just create these shots. So that, I think that was another sort of good example of where the technology enabled the creativity for me. And now I know how to do that. I do it all the time and I love it and it's fun.
Well, so this is a great opportunity for me to mention that for anyone who's watching, if you have questions for Chris or Lauren or Glyn, feel free to post those and we can see those in chat. And so we're certainly wanting to kind of hear and address any of the questions that you all have on your minds from this discussion. Chris, so I want to talk about working at creativity, and you mentioned earlier, taking a picture of a hubcap, and another photography book that I had picked up recently. The photographer talked about how he spent time photographing a staircase from like every imaginable way, right? So it was one of the ways that he tried to really do something creative by forcing himself to just take a subject and saying, now what are all the ways I can photograph that? And I think it's come out in Lauren's comments just now, and then in some others, where this is trial and error, right? This isn't I pick up a camera, the first shot that I take is the one that we print. So talk about how you work at creativity, and then when you're on set, how do you make sure that you kind of are able to capture the vision that you had at the onset?
Yes, that is a great question. Before I answer it, can I ask Lauren one quick question? Which made me think about with your wilting lettuce, which is how much of the food that you photograph do you actually eat?
I get this question so much.
I know, but
no, it's good. I would say as much of it as is possible. It's surprisingly a lot of it. I'll only really not eat something after if it's completely just bad or like not safe to eat anymore. But if it's fine, by the time I eat it, I don't care what it looks like. So
yes.
So when Lauren's busy, her food bill is very low. It's because she's
That's true for lunch, right? Okay, well, back to the question on creativity, which I think is really at the crux of a lot of this, because as photographers, essentially everything we do is about being creative. And so what I've tend to find is that there are two sides to creativity. One is there's a fight side. Jack London, you have to go after creativity with a club. You just have to fight tooth and nail to make something happen. So there are seasons and times for that fight. There's other times of creative flow, and that is just when the juices are flowing, everything's working. I mean, times, it's like the flow state, all those kind of things happen. And what I've come to kind of, I guess, appreciate is just leaning into whatever the state is versus wishing it was something else. So when things go wrong, rather than get frustrated or get down on myself, think, oh my gosh, everyone's put all this trust into me and I need to deliver and I'm not delivering and the clock's ticking, and, you know, say like, yeah, it's not working. That's part of creativity. And that's actually where usually my best ideas come from when stuff goes wrong. I think it forces us to get really ingenious. And, you know, whatever the example is, let's just say, you know, I have 3 daughters. Like if one of my daughters, I got the call right now, it said one of your daughters just had a mountain biking accident 5 miles away, I would find a way to get to her. I don't know how I would, but I would get there come hell or high water. If it's because of the necessity of the problem and overcoming the problem. So anyway, so I think just what you know, in my own process and what I encourage my students to do is to lean into that. And when the flow state's happening, you know, lean into that as well. Or if you're photographing the staircase from 1,000 perspectives and not one photograph is good, you know, finish that through that fight, you know, and some fights you lose. And then what I like to do is sit down with my students and ask, well, why do you think you lost? And they said, you know what? I love unfinished wood, and that staircase was painted white. And so that's really, really valuable lesson there. You like to see things that aren't quite perfect. You're more kind of a wabi-sabi, embrace imperfection kind of person versus a modern architectural thing. I'm kind of making this up. But the lesson there that you can learn from losing fights is probably more valuable than when you win. Because when you win, you're like, great, I won, and people are like, great, and I'm kind of like, okay. But when I have had friends or colleagues say, you know, Chris, that was good, but I think it could have been better, and then I say why, I realize, oh my gosh, you're so right, and then growth happens. So
yeah. Glyn, similar question to you. I mean, where do you, you know, how is it? I mean, you sort of embraced this idea of working at creativity with this latest project, right? You said, I don't have anything else to shoot, so I'm going to find something to shoot. But you know, in your more traditional work, can you know, speak to, you know, how do you really make sure that you're continuing to evolve as a photographer and in your creative style?
I'm hoping this answers the question, Matt, but as I was hearing Chris talking there, one thing that was making me think of when it comes to creativity and ensuring that I get the best possible results is that I think one thing I have is humility, in the fact that I accept that I don't know it all. And one thing I do religiously is I collaborate. You know, there's a group of people that I do a lot of work with. They will often join me on photo shoots, and you know, they've all got different experiences, different likes, tastes, dislikes. And I think that no matter how long you've been a photographer, or indeed if you are a photographer, I still think everybody's got something that of value they can bring to the table. So a recent photo shoot that a couple of weeks ago, I was over in Wales, and we photographed a guy that was made to look like a Welsh sheep farmer. And it was a great shoot because we had a few people there from all different backgrounds, but we're all good friends. And whilst I'm there with the idea, I come forward with the idea and the concept, we're all putting stuff into it. And it was actually somebody else's suggestion to move a little bit and go a little bit lower and get him to pose slightly different that won the shot. If I'd have stuck with what I wanted, there's no way it would have been as good. So I think my only advice for the way I keep creative, my advice for people to be creative would be to willing to take advice and opinion from people whose advice and opinions that you value. I guess we don't know it all, you know. So,
well, I actually want to touch on that topic further. This idea of you know, finding creativity and collaboration, for those keeping track. In terms of cliches, I've covered the light bulb, the puzzle pieces, the gears, and now the concept of thinking outside the box. Right? We talked earlier about trying to have those guardrails, right? Because it gives you the ability to kind of be creative within those guardrails. And so what I wanted to say, and use this cliche of outside of the box. Outside of the box is other people, right? And I think you just hit on it, Glyn. The folks that we collaborate with. You know, Lauren, when you mentioned food stylists, talk about, you know, where you're drawing your creative inspiration for your photography. and sort of how that collaborative process fuels creativity on set?
I would say for me, it's only really been in the last couple of years that I've noticed my own style getting stronger and also getting braver to try things that everyone else isn't doing. Coming back to sort of what we were talking about right at the beginning and trends, I think in the food world, there are always trends. There are so many trends. There's Christmas, there's unicorn smoothie bowls. That was a trend. You know, all of these things. And I think you have to try and do something different. Like, just because it's not been done before doesn't mean it's wrong. So people say shoot food on a neutral background. Why? Why not try shooting something on a really brightly colored background and then use your knowledge of things like color theory and lighting to make it interesting, make it work. Try it. If it doesn't work, great. You know, try again or don't. But it's sort of difficult. I use personal projects for a lot of those things. On set, it's difficult when you're collaborating with clients or people. They have a very specific outcome in mind with food photography, so it's not necessarily the forum to bring a bright pink background, you know, when they are looking to advertise a product. But that's why I think probably in any genre of photography, but particularly for something like food, doing personal projects and just shooting your own work for your own creativity is so important, because that's how you're going to grow and kind of exercise those creative muscles. Otherwise, if you're always confined to a brief, you're not going to have the room to always try the new things you want to try. And then once you've done it, put it in your portfolio and someone's like, oh, that's a really good idea. I really like that. Can you help me do something like that? And I think that's sort of how things go and how things will evolve, and give yourself that room to be creative without feeling confined.
Yeah. Chris, let's talk about like that collaboration you have with your subjects, right? I had someone shoot my headshot at Imaging USA earlier this year, and I felt bad for the photographer because I kind of was sensing that I was not a good subject, because he's like, turn your head and do this and stick your head out, and it felt really awkward for me, and as a result, I could tell I wasn't helping his process along. But I'm curious, because of the types of portraits that you do, that authentic portrait, you know, as you had cited, you know, how do you engage with that subject to get them to do what you see is going to be a good shot, but then also that, you know, is something that they're going to be comfortable leaning into?
Yeah, that is a great question. And so many fun topics. Humility, I like that idea. Personal projects, how to collaborate with in the portrait session, let's call it. I tend to think of it in a sort of both and approach. And so let me say this really briefly, which is a lot of times I feel like, Lauren, when you're talking about a personal project, sometimes that there's someone who's a pro who's doing all this client work, and then the thing is, well, make sure you still do personal stuff. But then there's the amateur who all they do is personal projects, and all they want to do is get the job. And so it's a different weight distribution. And so what I would say there is, let's say to the person who's just doing, they're like, I just want to get paid. Like, I'm done with, you know, everything's personal. I've been shooting for a year for personal. I want to turn my passion into profit. What I would say is find a way to do something for profit, but then also add something for you. So let me go back to your headshot. If, let's say, marketing director Matt's like, hey, I need a headshot, I would say, awesome, we're going to do that. This is forward facing. And a headshot is all about business commerce. It's for the actor who needs to get a job. It's for the real estate agent who needs. So a headshot is different than a portrait, in my opinion. So I'd say, hey, we're going to do this. We're going to do a headshot, but then we're also going to get a portrait. So first setup is, and I'm kind of telling you pretty snappy, like just assuming these are the two steps we're taking. So that if I go to the CEO of the company and say, hey, we're going to do a headshot, we finished, and I say, you know, by the way, I'm kind of mousy, I really want a deep, meaningful, soulful portrait. Do you have 5 more minutes? He's going to say no, or she's going to say no, right? But if I set up my expectation beforehand, saying there's 2 ideas I want to accomplish. One is forward facing. The other one is I know you're a parent of 5 kids and something. I want to create something that shows more this deep, friendly side of who you are. So we're going to do one over here, the other one over there by the window. It'll take 10 minutes. Boom, boom, and ask questions. So I have to give a little lead, and then I have to ask questions. And what the questions are, let me just think of this real quick, is I was photographing one of the top ballerinas in the world. I'd never photographed a ballerina before. And she was just perfect. Everything was literally, quote, on point. I mean, everything. But I couldn't get a portrait. So I could get really good ballet. And so for me, I'm always both and. I need ballet and I need a portrait. Because ballet it's perfection, and portrait is very human. And so I just asked questions, and my question was, well, this must be so hard to manage the amount of training you do. What do you do outside of your training? And she said, oh, I love, are you guys ready for it? Puzzles. And she went on talking about puzzles, and this one puzzle she's working on with her cat next to her, and she just da-da-da, puzzles this and puzzles that. And then, of course, once she started talking puzzles, I was able to get a portrait, more of the person. It had nothing to do with puzzles, but the question added some humanity to the moment. And so what I try to encourage my students to do is, if you're on site, let's say if I was even hired to do food photography, which I'm not hired to, but I would maybe get food photograph, and then the food stylist, I would say, I really would love to have a portrait of you because your craft's so interesting to me. I would do the food photograph and the portrait. And so I'm always asking that question, yes, and both, and what else is here that I might be overlooking in this moment? And then how can I collaborate with this person to get to that? Because what happens, and again, I know I'm talking so much, so I'm sorry, you guys, but what it tends to happen to my photography students and me is you have all these ideas you don't verbalize, and then you just like expect your subject to know where you're going. And the subject's like, what? And then this is the same thing that happens when you photograph a stranger. My students walk up to a stranger, and out of the blue, I ask if they can photograph them, and the stranger's just like, who are you? And I'm walking to work, and so you have to, collaboration means you have to connect. There's sort of an arc. You have to warm up. You have to humanize. You have to be willing to be humble. You have to, anyway, all those things. Sorry that's so long. But does that resonate with you guys too, Glyn and Lauren?
That totally does, because what you said there about it made me think about one of the things that I do is you almost play down the photography side of it. It's like when I mentioned about the fact that I will talk to somebody. If I turned up to photograph you, Chris, I'd be at your house for maybe half an hour talking about all manner of things, not even the photo shoot. But eventually when we do the photo shoot, I kind of play it down. It's not a big deal. Do you know what I mean? And we just keep the conversation going whilst we're doing that. And that, for me, I find really helps to humanize, as you say, the whole kind of process. Because the minute you start talking about the photography, I certainly find that people start to get that little bit of anxiety. And, the talking beforehand has tried to get rid of that. And then when we start to then become the photographer, what we think is the photographer, that's when it all changes. So humanizing it, I like that. I'm making notes here, Chris. I'll have you know.
Yeah.
I hope this is in your book, by the way.
Yeah.
Well,
but it's the same thing too, Lauren. It feels you're doing with your test lighting beforehand. It's like that, and I guess what it is, there's a process to photography, which I think people who aren't photographers don't realize. And it's the same thing I try to explain to them. It's like having friends over for dinner. The way you greet them at the door, the music that's on, the candles that are lit, the table, that when you bring out the food, where the seating is, all that makes a good meal. It's not just like, boom, sit down, meal, eat now. It's like, no. And it's like everything that leads up to it is as important as the moment, and actually after the moment, because there is always this sense of, at least with portrait sittings and stuff, there's the finish, and how do you finish? And let's say when the guests come over to my house, if Glyn comes over, I walk him to his car, and we hang out, we talk a little bit more, and we give him, I guess COVID, we don't give a hug, but we say goodbye. And so you want to end on that positive notes as well, versus sometimes my students, I find they're done and they're just so flustered, they didn't anticipate, like, here I have this celebrity in front of me, I don't know what to do now because all I've been thinking about is the photograph. And so then they kind of bumble the ending. But what we know about human interaction is we remember the first few seconds of it and also the ending, how we felt throughout, of course, as well. And so thinking of that whole arc is a really important part of that creative process.
Yeah, there's a takeaway that I've got from this conversation where that it's important to highlight. One, creativity is very subjective, right? And so, a lot of what I think is important is that creativity that's unique to you, right? It's about being yourself and sort of letting your own creativity take hold, and then you blend that with the photographer's work, right? And that skill that you evolve and develop over time. And that's where you can create very, breathtaking, standout photographs, is where when people can see that the photographer is, trial and error, practice and repeat, but then also letting themselves kind of come out a little bit along with that final photograph. Would you all agree, or what might you add? A thumbs up from Chris. What do you think, Lauren?
No, I agree.
I'm with Chris and Lauren.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We all agree.
See, I passed the test, right? I learned something. I got the right takeaways. So we have just about
maybe just to add to that, and there's no, here we are at Tether Tools, so I gotta at least weave that back into the creative conversation, and is that you want to find the tools that help you to be yourself, help you to be expressive, help you to do all these things we're talking about. And so there's a reason why we're in this booth, so to speak. It is because those tools can really allow you to do that, develop that self-awareness, develop that feedback, and achieve those results. And so I think for photographers, a lot of photographers love portfolio reviews. Of course, I get emails every day like, can you look at my work? Is it good or bad? Or, and you need outside perspectives, but we also need that internal conversation. And so for me, having this little bad boy there helps me say, okay, just for a second, let me put on my blinders to the rest of the world and let me just look and absorb and evaluate and ask myself or ask someone on set, like Glyn was saying, when I did a shoot recently, I couldn't figure out why I didn't like it. And I asked one of my friends, I was like, I just can't figure this out. And he's like, oh, because of A, B, and C. And I thought, oh my gosh, you're so right. And so I encourage photographers to find tools, whatever they are, that allow you to find and develop your voice. Because without a voice, without a style, photography isn't as fun. It isn't as gratifying, and you don't grow as fast, and you don't get as much work. So it's not just about money, but it's about everything. So, got to throw that plug in. And grateful to you guys, Matt, for the stuff you guys create. I mean, I'm so thankful as a human and as a creative for that. So.
No, I appreciate that. And I think, what's interesting about, all the benefits of tethering that we led this conversation off with and we've touched on throughout the discussion, there is a lot more vulnerability to doing that when you first start, right? Because, generally, if you're not tethering, you can sort of protect your creativity on the back of your inside of your camera. And, when you're tethering, it's there for everybody to see. But I think that, to your point, that helps you kind of be intentional. It also helps you to solicit that feedback. And in the end, you hit those time frames. Like it creates this different sort of flow that organically that image comes together, with your expertise, the feedback of others, the requirements of the brief. And, then that photograph, that image then can live to perform the impact that it was meant to, whether it's, someone's personal headshot for LinkedIn, or whether it's going to go, out on Instagram to try to get people to that small restaurant, or cocktail bar, or whether it's just to let people know that it's still important to understand and be aware and celebrate World War II veterans. I think that is, the end result of all of this is, images that have the appropriate impact for whatever they were intended to be.
I think just to add to that, Matt, just one thing is that an unseen benefit maybe that's never mentioned about tethering is that it actually helps you to slow down. I think in this digital age, we can be so, taking photos because it doesn't cost anything every time we press that shutter. The fact that we have to slow down to then take that moment to look at the screen, say, right, what have I got? Reevaluate it. Like what Chris was saying there, when he's taking the picture, he just didn't like it when it came on the screen. He was able to then look at it and say, right, I need to go lower, I need to get closer, and all that kind of stuff. That's for me is probably one of the huge benefits of tethering is that it slowed me down, and it allowed me to kind of just relax into the photo shoot as opposed to just bang 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 bang. So that is always top of the list probably for me.
Great point to bring up, Glyn. Thank you. So we have just about 5 minutes left, and so straying away from all those cliches that the ad guy was wanting to share, and kind of just letting everyone refocus on some of the brilliant work that you all created and shared with us for this presentation today. One of the things I wanted to ask about, right? So what I would say is anyone who sees this, I'd encourage you all to go out and follow Chris's work and Glyn's work and Lauren's work. They're great educators, not just for Tether Tools, but in their own channel. So make sure that you continue to learn from them outside of this presentation. I wanted to ask each of you, from a creative standpoint, who's a photographer you admire that isn't maybe talked about enough, or just that you think would be important for people to go and check out their work. So Chris, let's start with something that you want to share.
Okay, I have to
Glyn or Lauren.
Yeah, someone else jump in. I got to think of someone here real quick. Give me a second.
All right.
Someone else wants.
I'll dive in then, and it isn't somebody that's not mentioned a lot. We do hear his name a lot. He's a great good friend of mine, Joel Grimes. And although we can say, yeah, Joel Grimes, it's there's no question, wonderful photographer, but it's his work ethic that I really admire, and the way that he kind of handles himself and just deals with people. Yes, I love his photography, but it's more than anything, it's his just the way he kind of just handles himself, and he's always busy. He's the one that kind of gave me the advice about doing the projects. He's the one that gave me advice about going out there and photographing everything until you realize exactly what you don't want to photograph, which means you're left with what you do want to photograph. So I've learned a lot from Joel, but I thoroughly admire his work ethic. And I'm not going to embarrass Chris, but I messaged Chris yesterday to say that he too has been instrumental in me being able to sort of do the work that I do today and live the life that I do. So Chris, I thank you as well for that. So I'll say Joel and Chris.
Yeah. Those are great examples. Chris, did you get someone come to mind?
No one specific comes to mind. This is kind of the, back and forth high five fest, but Glyn's work that has so much meaning. I had recently been feeling like some of the work I'd done is kind of didn't have a lot of meaning in it. And then seeing that of just like, oh my gosh, this is so much more important than cameras and light. So I'd echo that right back to you. But the thing I would say that I do encourage others, and I try to do myself, is that picking up on what Glyn said, is finding photographers that you admire that are equally, or that are good at their craft, but better at life. And that kind of align with what your life is. And maybe I'll start a little negative and then go positive, which I think is sometimes, Plutarch said, music to find harmony must investigate discord. But there was one photographer that I admired, and I just was like, I can't believe all the stuff that this person does. And I realized that person had decided to never have kids in order to be able to pursue his career, which is a valid, great decision. But my life decision was to have 3 kids. And so I was like, wow, I'm trying to follow someone. Or maybe another thing is like, you're trying to follow someone who has a trust fund and doesn't need an income. And then but you don't know that until you discover, oh, they have a trust fund. That's why they can surf so much. That's why they buy all that gear. That's why they do all that shooting. And so I realized I was following the wrong person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so trying to find those people to follow, like Joel, who is like an amazing human being, husband, dad, and creator, creative, and that what I found for me fuels my creativity more so than thinking, and again, not trying to be too negative, but like that person in New York, I'm like, I don't live in New York. I can't, I don't have access to the same talent, to the same models. And so trying to find some people to follow, maybe, like, I don't know. So that's the thing that comes to mind is those
Sure.
are the mentors, virtual mentors, or people who have impacted me the most.
Yeah. Well, Lauren, I do want to give you a chance to answer that before we wrap. So who would you call attention to
Yeah, sure.
for the attendees?
I think everything Chris just said is really good advice, and it's definitely something that I've noticed in the food world as well. But saying that, I do have someone in mind.
Yeah.
It's actually one of my friends who, he's a portrait photographer. He's called Tommy Reynolds. He's got a YouTube channel and everything. I learned so much about lighting from him. And he photographs people, I photograph food, but there's a lot of similarity in lighting because food is kind of like portraiture like that. But aside from him, I love following him. He's a great educator, really, really nice person. Photographs amazing scenes. But something that someone said to me recently that I thought was really important as a food photographer is your outward sort of online, your presence can just become not you, like very, very impersonal. If you're constantly sharing images of food and you never share anything about yourself, you take the human element out of your work. So just learning to be a little bit more open and share a little bit about you, maybe be in the photo sometimes. Don't be afraid to get in front of the camera. And I do that a lot with sort of behind the scenes and other little updates, but I think it helps people connect to your work if they know you as well. So I spent a lot of years being really afraid to be in front of the camera at all. And I just wanted to put photos of food out. And I think your work loses a bit of impact if you hide yourself. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. So check out Joel, check out Tommy, and then make sure that anyone you're following is somebody that kind of resonates with you and being grounded in your own values, because that's where you're going to be able to like learn and listen to the inspiration that they provide. Well, I really appreciate your time. I know it's late in Europe, and each of you is giving up your weekend to be with us. Thank you so much for everything that you shared. For those of you still attending SONY Kando for the rest of the day, I'd encourage you to stop by the Tether Tools booth. If you're interested in our gear, you can get discounts through Adorama and B&H during the event. And then sort of one teaser to let everyone part ways with is that we are going to have an announcement in September related to tethering Sony with Adobe Lightroom. So